Well, good morning. I'm so glad to see all of you guys today and look forward to spend a little bit of our time together, just kind of going over some of the things that we need to talk about today. Uh, One of the things that we are going to be talking about today is continued responses to the spread of the Industrial Revolution. That's what we'll be talking about today. We're going to talk about uh, different responses to the Industrial Revolution. And we've been talking about the Industrial Revolution for some time. And what I want to talk about today is there's two different ways that some people, some countries, some individuals responded to the Industrial Revolution. And one is through reform, and the other way is through revolution. And so that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about two different responses to the Industrial Revolution. We've actually talked about some of these themes already. We're going to talk about those who look at the Industrial Revolution and see the shortcomings and want to make reforms. There's others that look at the Industrial Revolution and see the shortcomings, and they want more than reform. They want to make revolution. So first of all, let's look a little bit about the reactions of the reformers. Let's go ahead and look at the reactions of the reformers. So during the 19th century, these 1800s with these factories, all these different things, we see long hours, we see low wages, we see unsafe work conditions. These were common in factory work. These were sadly common in factory work. There is no rules, there's no regulations. The Industrial Revolution is bringing these new situations to bear. Should there be a minimum age? Should there be a limit of how many hours you should work per week? Are there regulations about health concerns? None of those things had been dealt with yet. And so during the 19th century, we see there was long hours, there was low wages, there was unsafe conditions, and this was just sadly common in factory work. So now the question is, what do we do if we are working in these factories? What do we do to combat that situation? Well, workers decided in order to fight for better conditions and higher pay, workers formed what we call labor unions. Workers formed what we call labor unions. And you probably are familiar to some degree with what this means. It means that you and I, what we're going to do is we're going to work together. We're going to unionize together. And if we don't get treated right, if we don't get treated respectfully, what you and I can do is we can go and strike. We can decide that if the company isn't going to pay us right, if the company's not going to listen to our demands because we've unionized, because we're all in this together, we will go on strike in order to get the demands we have. So to get better conditions, to get higher wages, workers formed what we call labor unions. And we still see that to this day. And so there's a name for this idea of these labor unions. There's a name for this idea that we are going to be collectively working together to improve our situation, our lot in life. And that's called collective bargaining. It says collective bargaining helped workers to organize in order to earn a contract. Collective bargaining helped workers to organize in order to earn a contract. And with a contract, you have the boss saying, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z for you. With a contract, you have the boss in writing, committing certain concessions to you. And this is one of the beautiful things that collective bargaining was able to do, that you're able to organize in order to earn a contract. So it says below that their work resulted in things that we appreciate to this day. In fact, their work resulted in the 5-day work week. That this collective bargaining, that these strikes, this worked in order to earn what we today still appreciate, the 5-day work week. That was not a given thing, you know. In fact, much of the way that we look at the week is actually inspired, oddly enough, from the Bible. You know, from the the Judeo-Christian worldview, there's 7 days in the week, right? Starts with Sunday's the first day, Saturday's the last day. And traditionally, in the Old Testament, in the Hebrew Bible, you got 1 day off of the week, and that was Saturday. Saturday was the Sabbath. And so you had that Saturday off. But then as Christians did not celebrate their holy day on Saturday. You might remember that in Christian thinking, Jesus was crucified and killed on a Friday. He was the tomb on Friday. On the tomb on Saturday, he rose from the dead on Sunday in Christian thinking. And because of that, because of the resurrection, Christians had their holy day on Sunday. So it kind of made sense for these early labor organizers to push for, you know, what we might call the weekend, you know, this Saturday and Sunday off. And we actually see this coming into fruition, this idea of a 5-day work week with Saturday, Sunday off as a result of these reform movements in the 1800s. Another thing we not only see is not only are there reform movements in factories, not only are there reform movements in, you know, the conditions through collective bargaining, but we also see that voting rights increases in the 1800s. It says that voting had originally been limited to men who owned property. Here in Britain, voting had been limited to men who owned property. And so that immediately eliminated huge percentages of the population. So it's not just that it was a man-only thing to vote. It's not only that it was a white male privilege to vote. It was a white male privilege for those who owned property. And so immediately that means that so many huge percentages of the population in Great Britain have no direct participation power in democracy. Be something that we're going to see that change. And so, you know, we see these different patterns that occur. We see that voting in Great Britain, voting was limited to men who owned property. And it says that laws slowly were passed that expanded this idea of who could vote. Laws in Great Britain were passed to expand to those who could vote, which was a good thing. And with more working class voters, laws were passed that the poor. Because listen, if more and more poor working class people have the right to vote, as soon as we get rid of the requirement that I own property to be able to show up to the polls, that means the kind of people that can show up to the polls are just regular, ordinary people. And if I now have to earn the right, though, the vote of ordinary, regular people, I'm going to start thinking about what are the things that they're interested in? What are the things that they're worried about? What are the kind of concerns that they have? And so the thing about voting rights is more people get the right to vote, the more we see the government interested in protecting workers, the more we see the government interested in passing laws that limit how many hours you have to work, or introducing things like overtime, or introducing things like health and safety regulations. The increasing amount of people who get to vote is going to actually help to pass laws that the poor are interested in. On voting rights in Britain, we see that all men won the right to vote in Britain in 1918. All men won the right to vote in Great Britain in 1918. And so we're going to continue just kind of talk about the British, and then we're going to transition to talk about how we experience these voting issues in the United States. So in Britain, voting was limited to men who own property. Slowly laws were passed that expanded who could vote. With more working class voters, laws were passed that actually helped the poor. because now the poor people are people that I need to keep happy. And so I'm going to start thinking about tailoring laws that will assist them. Finally, it was not till 1918 that all men in Britain won the right to vote. And that's pretty crazy to think that it was not until 1918 that we actually see all men being able to win that right to vote. So actually, it's just over, this being filmed in 2020, just over 100 years of the right for all men to vote. And so that's kind of an interesting situation that we see. It says there's not only, of course, the men's right to vote, but also it says there is a movement called the suffrage movement. And in parentheses, there's this word, a suffragist. So if you are working for women's suffrage, that is kind of a funny word, but that word, women's suffrage, it means the right for women to vote. That's what women's suffrage is. And it doesn't actually sound very good. You know, it's like, oh, I'm advocating for women's suffrage. And because that word suffrage, it sounds actually like a negative. A lot of times people without any sort of context don't know that that means the woman's right to vote. And so there's examples of like people will go asking their high school fellow students, hey, you know what? I have this petition. I'd like you to sign this petition. It's calling for an end to women's suffrage. You know, women have had to deal with this issue for such a long time. We just want to raise awareness. We want to say enough's enough. We want to put an end to women's suffrage. And people not knowing that women's suffrage is actually the right to vote, people are like, oh yeah, well, I'm totally for, you know, putting an end to women's suffrage. You're right. Enough is enough. And people will sign petitions and things like that, not knowing, not understanding that women's suffrage is actually the women's right to vote. And so we see that in the early 1900s, people are arguing that we need to be fighting for women's right to vote. And so those people are called suffragists. If you watch the old Disney movie, Mary Poppins, you might remember that. The mom in Mary Poppins, she's never really home. She's always out protesting, organizing rights for women. And she's an example of a suffragist. She's a woman fighting for the right to vote. And that would happen eventually. Women, these suffragists, these women fighting for the right to vote, earned their right to vote in 1928. In 1928. So that's voting rights in Great Britain. We see that little by little, voting rights are increasing. More regular people are having access to the ballot. And if more regular people can vote, I want to start thinking about passing laws that protect working class men and protecting women, because now they're voters. What about in the United States? Well, in the United States, voting had originally also been limited to men who owned property. That's also here in the United States, that broadly, generally in the United States, voting had been limited to men who own property. And so we kind of like talked about this earlier, is like, what was really revolutionary about the American Revolution? You know, before the American Revolution, who were the people really in power? Well, they were rich, they were white, they were often business people. They were rich, they were white, they were often business people. Think about like some of these important people in American history. George Washington, super ridiculously rich, right? These people in power, you know, were either wealthy or they were intellectuals. Thomas Jefferson, ridiculously rich. You know, in the back of the nickel, we have Thomas Jefferson on the nickel. In the back is his mansion called Monticello. If you know George Washington, he has a mansion in Virginia, a place called Mount Vernon. You can still go there today. It's amazing. So before the American Revolution, rich white people were in charge. After the Revolution, rich white males were in charge. So some people have asked, you know, there are elements, people pointed out, there's elements of the American Revolution that are not so revolutionary. And before we, you know, compare ourselves to the French Revolution and say, oh, we're so much better than the French, there's some obvious ways the French Revolution failed, right? Like the French Revolution started off, yes, equality, liberty, all this kind of good stuff. They ended up killing kings, they removed Christianity, and there was this reign of terror. And ultimately, what happened in the French Revolution? Well, you have another person, Napoleon Bonaparte, crowning himself emperor. And, whatever happened to representative democracy, it kind of fades away. So in many ways, the French Revolution failed and nothing changed ultimately as a direct result of that. But in our own American Revolution, what was revolutionary? Well, part of the problem was that that property ownership was a requirement for you to be able to vote, right? And so we do see a slow transition away from that. In fact, there's a president who helps to initiate an era of moving away from this idea that rich white people alone have a say, and that was Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson has a very mixed record. He for sure did some terrible things, particularly against Native American populations who he saw standing in the way of manifest destiny. But there is a positive legacy in that Andrew Jackson does initiate, he is part of a movement to expand who gets the right to vote. And there's a name referring to this general period. We call this general phase in American history Jacksonian Democracy. And Andrew Jackson was a person who didn't fit the mold of those previous leaders in the United States as like this well-educated person from a big East Coast, region. Andrew Jackson kind of, presented himself as a president with an appeal towards common people. And he wanted common people to be able to vote. And so one of the things we see under Andrew Jackson is regular people, non-property owners, get the right to vote. It says, Jacksonian Democracy by 1856 allowed all white men to vote. Allowed all white men to vote. And so that's definitely a step in the right direction, apart from the fact that it says white men. You might remember that there's 3 amendments that really also make a big difference. The 13th Amendment, which ends slavery. The 14th Amendment, which makes former slaves citizens. And the 15th Amendment, which gives Black former slaves who are men the right to vote. So again, you see these steps in the right direction. But even with Black men, former slaves, giving them the right to vote, practically, there's all kinds of situations and circumstances that limit the right of Black men to vote. There are these things called Jim Crow laws. They would require you to, pass a literacy test, or there was things called a poll tax that enable to vote. You have to pay a fee. And while that fee might be something that a white man would be able to pay with some degree of ease, a Black person without that same social economic advantage may not be able to. And so there was the legal technical right to vote, but there's these laws called Jim Crow laws that made it really difficult for Black men to exercise their constitutional right. Well, even with the Constitution granting Black men the right to vote, it still leaves women out of any sort of electoral participation at all until the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment was passed by Congress in 1919, but the way our Constitution works is not only does it have to be passed by Congress, then it has to go to the states, and then the states have to also ratify it. It's actually super hard to change the Constitution. You have to get Congress to pass it, and then you have to get the states to ratify it within a relatively short amount of time. The states do ratify the 19th Amendment in 1920. This gives women the right to vote. Women get the right to vote with the 19th Amendment. So actually, this is 1920 when it was ratified. In 2020, this year, we are the 100th anniversary of women having the right to vote. And so it's kind of an interesting thing that we see this general increase in progress. And now that women have the right to vote, lawmakers are going to be interested in passing laws that appeal to women. Now that poor white men can vote, lawmakers are going to be interested in passing laws that appeal to poor white men. And one of the things that we do see happening, particularly early on in Great Britain, is child labor being an issue that people were upset and concerned about. Child labor was banned. In 1843, they banned work by children under age 10. And they said, look, under age 10, that is unacceptable. And, we see that that's not perfect. That's not a perfect thing that we're saying that 11-year-olds can go to work in a mine or whatever, or 12-year-olds can work in a factory. But again, it is not a perfect solution, but it is slow progress in dealing with the issues that concern people most at this day. If you ever read Charles Dickens, Charles Dickens wrote novels, but also short stories. Like if you've ever seen a movie version of A Christmas Carol, maybe, or even a cartoon version, there's like a Muppets version of the Christmas Carol. There's like a Mickey Mouse version too, like a 30-minute version. But Charles Dickens himself, his dad made a lot of foolish financial decisions, and Charles Dickens, as a result, his father was taken away to debtor's prison, where you could actually go to jail for owning money. But Charles Dickens, as a child, actually also had to spend time working in a factory. I mean, we would not even imagine that happening today, that your parents get in some credit card debt, your parents make some mistakes, and then you end up going to a factory making shoes or whatever the case may be. But that was common at this time. And so these laws that slowly get passed that deal with and limiting ages of who can go work in factories and mines, not perfect, but we see slow progress dealing with some of these most important issues like child labor. In 1881, British laws required mandatory education for children aged 5 to 10. In Britain, they required mandatory education for children ages 5 to 10. And so again, what happens age 11 to 18? It's not required. You likely are going to show up to go to work before that. And so this is also a new thing. We live in a world in the United States in 2020 where there is the sense that you have to go to school. You can't get hired at a place, at age 12, age 13. And so we, in our country today, expect that society is going to provide free public schooling. And that's something that even actually a lot of countries all around the world don't have. All around the world, there are places where there is no free public education. Even right now in 2020, the spring of 2020, in the middle of a global pandemic where there's a shutdown order, where there's quarantine orders, to some degree, society expects that teachers are going to continue to from home, from the front of my house, these ideas that you deserve a free public education, and to some degree that it's mandatory for you to be a part of this in some way, comes from these responses of reformers to the Industrial Revolution. As a result of this would redefine the role of children. These laws, this attitude, this time period would redefine the role of children, because children, to some degree, were seen as future workers. That, I'm going to have these kids, and these kids, they're young enough, they're small enough, we can send them into the mines. They're young enough, they're small enough, their little hands can get into those factory machines when they get jammed to clear the jams. Now we're not seeing children quite like that anymore. They're children that in certain periods of their life, schooling is what should be experienced by them. So there are some people who react to the revolution, to the Industrial Revolution, say reform. We're going to make it safer. We're going to limit how many hours you work. We're going to redefine the role of children. We're no longer going to send children out to these factories. But also, we see this general progress of who can vote. It's not just going to be white property owning men, it's going to be all men. It's not just going to be all men, it's going to be eventually women as well. But there's other reactions to the Industrial Revolution, and this is by intellectuals. So intellectuals are people who are not going to be out there in the factories themselves. Intellectuals are going to be people who are generally well-read. They love reading books. They love studying. They love writing. Those are intellectuals, and they also have a response to the Industrial Revolution. The most famous intellectual that has a response to the Industrial Revolution is Karl Marx. And we've talked about Karl Marx a bit before. Karl Marx is the guy who starts communism. Sometimes we might call it Marxism, but he was definitely an intellectual. He didn't spend his time working in a factory and growing frustrated. He observed life in factories, but then he wrote about it. Karl Marx did not experience, poverty as a result of him working hard in factory life. He did have some challenges, but most of his life, he was a writer. Most of his life, he was a thinker. He observed what he thought was wrong with the Industrial Revolution and wrote about it. He was an intellectual. And Karl Marx witnessed the cruel conditions in European factories. So he witnessed that. He didn't personally experience it as a factory worker himself, but Karl Marx did witness the cruel conditions in European factories. And so that is a result of the Industrial Revolution. Yeah, there's some good things about the Industrial Revolution. Prices get cheaper, prices go down, the accessibility of stuff goes up, but there's some brutal conditions that are occurring in order to get there. In fact, one of the things that he noted, and was correct in noting this, was that capitalism produced inequality. He was able to observe correctly that capitalism produces inequality. Because as factories do well, owners of the factories become ridiculously rich, right? And so Karl Marx kind of saw this contrast. He said, how is it that the owners of these factories get ridiculously rich at the expense of, in his mind, these workers laboring so hard, these workers sometimes endangering themselves? How do we match these two things, that these workers do so much work, get paid relatively little, while the owners of the factories just become millionaires? They get more and more and more wealthy. And even if there's dangerous situations that could even cause workers to lose hands or lose body parts or maybe damage their eyes, or even if factory workers, and sometimes were locked inside the factory and they died in the factory due to unsafe conditions. We see sometimes fires would break out in factories, and factory owners, not trusting their workers, would actually lock the door to make sure they couldn't leave during the workday. And what happens if there was a fire? Well, factory workers would die inside the factory. How is it, Karl Marx wondered, that this system of capitalism is allowed to continue unchallenged? Well, he wanted to challenge it. He noticed that capitalism produced inequality. And it says from 1780, to give you an example, that inequality, output per laborer in the United Kingdom, in the UK and Great Britain grew 25%. In other words, how hard workers are working, they're producing an increase of 25%, but wages barely rose 5%. So that doesn't make sense. The average worker is churning out 25% more, but their wages only went up 5%. If I was expected to work 25% more hours in the week, if I was expected to put in 25% more effort and product, and I only got a 5% raise, there's something wrong here. There's a disconnect here. And that's what Karl Marx took note of, about this disconnect. Also, there's some practical results of how poor people are dealing, how poor people are facing the challenges of the world in the Industrial Revolution. In fact, it says that during the German cholera epidemic of 1892, this is a disease that broke out in 1892, the mortality rate, in other words, the death rate of individuals with an income of less than 800 marks, that's like their dollars, or they're called marks, a year, compared with those who earn 50,000. So there's two different groups: those who earn 50,000, which are like well-off middle-class people, rich people, and then the poor worker making 800. The mortality rate for those poor people was 13 times higher. The mortality rate for those who were poor was 13 times higher. So Karl Marx looked at this. Karl Marx looked and said, listen, workers are working and producing more, and they're not getting paid the same level. They're producing 25% more, they're getting paid only 5% more. And he also said, listen, when an epidemic hits, the poor people are the people most likely to suffer. We might even see a parallel in this 2020 pandemic with COVID-19. There's a stay-at-home quarantine order that if you're a non-essential worker, you can't go to work. Well, what does that mean if you are a waiter? What does that mean if you work retail? What does that mean if you are a barber? What does that mean if you do nails for a living? The government is prohibiting you from going to work. How do you pay for anything? How do you pay for your rent, for your mortgage? And then there's those people who are essential workers. Many of them are doctors. Many of them are nurses. And guess what? They continue to go to work and continue to get paid. Some wealthy people can navigate this time because they have a savings. Some people can navigate this time because they have money that they have set aside for difficult times. But what about the poor people that are living paycheck to paycheck during a government mandated shutdown? These poor people might be the ones to make some of these difficult decisions. And so and that's why actually even today, when you look at responses to the pandemic in 2020, people are like, oh, this is another example of how capitalism kills poor people. This is another example of how capitalism has failed us. You see a lot of this being discussed on Twitter, a lot of this getting discussed on social media. So Karl Marx recognized these things. Capitalism, according to Karl Marx, produced needless suffering. Capitalism, according to Karl Marx, produced needless suffering. And so if that's all that capitalism gets us, needless suffering, you know what it's time to do? It's time to get rid of capitalism. That's what Karl Marx said. And so his solution, Karl Marx's solution, was for the state to redistribute the wealth. The solution is to have the state redistribute the wealth. What we need to do is we need to take money from rich people and we need to redistribute it among the poor. And we see some of this rhetoric, some of this discussion, even in 2020. One of the most outspoken, famous members of the United States Congress is a representative from the state of New York named Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And you might remember that she famously asked the question, is it even morally right to be a billionaire? Should billionaires even exist? To the point that in the 2020 election, in the Democratic primary, when a billionaire, Michael Bloomberg, was running for the Democratic ticket, he was asked in a debate, Mr. Bloomberg, should you exist? That was the question, because there's people who are considering, is it right to have billionaires? Or is being a rich millionaire or billionaire actually evil? And we see this with increasing popularity because, as of today, Bernie Sanders has dropped out of the 2020 nomination. This is the second time Bernie Sanders made it to the almost to the end, And 4 years ago, Bernie Sanders dropped out as Hillary Clinton won the nomination. But Bernie Sanders started this revolution of young people thinking about socialism. And even again today, Bernie Sanders came in second again to Joe Biden, but not without first starting a revolution of young people who are very interested and passionate about socialism, about some of these ideas that Karl Marx would have been excited about, of getting the government, the state, to redistribute the wealth. Capitalism, Karl Marx argued, created classes of people. And that's a problem. Karl Marx said that the problem is that they are making classes of people, two general groups of people. There's the bourgeoisie, which are the factory workers. I'm sorry, the factory owners. The bourgeoisie are the factory owners. These are the rich people. These are the people with money. These are the people who are in charge. The bourgeoisie are the factory owners. And the second group of people are the proletariat. This is the working class people. These are just like the ordinary, everyday people who are in the factories working for the government. And Karl Marx said that the means of production, the machines, the mines, the factories, must be seized by the working class. If you seize something, you're taking something by force. And that's what Karl Marx said that you need to do, is that you have to seize the factories. You have to take the mines. You have to take over the machines, because you know what? The people in charge are not going to give up their wealth on their own. And that's why the last line of Karl Marx's famous book called Communist Manifesto, it says, "Workers of the world unite." We have to get, under communism, all the workers of the world to agree that the rich people are the problem. We need to take the factories from them. We need to take the machines from them. We need to take the mines from them. We need the workers of the world to unite, and we need to seize. We need to violently take the means of production. It must be seized by the working class. Karl Marx and his co-author, because he didn't write Communist Manifesto by himself, there was a co-author, a guy whose last name was Engels. They did not want reform, they wanted revolution. They did not want reform, they wanted revolution. They thought that you cannot reform something that is so sick, it's so messed up. That's what capitalism is. Capitalism makes wealth for the 1%, and the 99 are the oppressed. They're the ones, the 99% are the ones who are working hard to get rich people rich. So this is kind of almost like this government-directed Robin Hood, where you're taking from the rich, giving it to the poor, because do rich people really need all that money? Karl Marx and Engels, his co-author, did not want reform. They wanted revolution. And this revolution has all different aspects of life, of things they want to get rid of. For example, they called for the abolition. The word abolition means to get rid of. They wanted the abolition of all nationalities. They thought it doesn't make sense for you to be worried about that you are French and you are British and you are German. You know what you are? You're either a worker, you're part of the proletariat, or you are the bourgeoisie, those evil factory owners. They wanted to get rid of nationalities. They thought nationalities was bad. They thought the best thing was the solution was for the state to redistribute the wealth. And as you have the state redistributing the wealth, we need to focus on getting rid of other things that don't make sense. They wanted the abolition of nationalities. They also, second thing that they wanted was the abolition of religion. They thought religion was another big problem. And they famously, Karl Marx said that religion was the opiate of the masses. Karl Marx famously had said that religion was the opiate of the masses. That word opiate is a reference to the drug opium. You might remember we talked about this back in China. There was something called the Opium Wars, where the Europeans, they were in a situation where they're just buying a bunch of Asian products. There was nothing China really wanted or needed from them. So the British started pushing a highly addictive drug called opium on China. And this was something that was so addictive and devastating. And that's kind of the analogy that Karl Marx used to describe religion. He said that religion was addictive and it was devastating. that people were consuming religion just like a drug, and it might make you feel good for a time or a season, but really religion takes you nowhere, Karl Marx said. And he said that religion is something that poor people are interested in. And actually, if you look at society, who are the people who tend to be most religious? Well, it's the poor. Who are the people who are the most religion? Often it's the uneducated. Now, of course, there are educated people who are religious. Of course, there's intellectuals who are religious. But it is true that the more education you get, the higher there are instances of people questioning religion, traditional religion, or opening themselves up to atheism. Karl Marx said that religion was the opiate of the masses. Well, not only does he want to get rid of nationalities, not only does he want to get rid of religion, but he also calls for the abolition of private property. The abolition of private property. He thought the idea that me owning a home, that's wrong, for me to own a house, for me to own a business, for me to say this is mine. Well, what about the poor person who doesn't have? What about the homeless person who doesn't have? Karl Marx called for the abolition of private property. And so if you were to kind of like think about what else reminds you of this pattern of trying to get rid of the rich working class, trying to get rid of people traditionally in power, trying to get rid of religion, what other revolution that we've already talked about does this sound like? Hopefully, this might remind you of some of the extremes that we saw in the French Revolution, where they were killing kings, where they got rid of Christ in the public atmosphere, in the public realm. The French Revolution has actually been compared to this communist revolution that Karl Marx is describing. He also called for the abolition of inheritance. Your inheritance, when your grandma dies, when your grandpa dies, when your parents die, the idea is that the wealth that they have accumulated over their life gets passed down to you. Karl Marx said, well, why should that be? He called for the abolition of inheritance, and also called for the state ownership of all factories. The state ownership of all factories. He said, we don't think that Steve Jobs should be a guy who owns a company. We don't think there should be a Bill Gates who owns a company, that there is a Zuckerberg who should be running Facebook, or Jeff Bezos running Amazon. Instead of individuals owning this, you know what? You know who should run Amazon? The United States government. You know who should run Facebook? The United States government. Instead of the Walton family running Walmart, the United States government should do that instead. He called for all factories, the state ownership of all factories, that the state should be owning and running the factories. It's not just factories that he wanted the state to get involved with, but he also called for the abolition of the family. The abolition of the family. Karl Marx's revolution was in every aspect of life. It's not just property, it's not just religion, but now Karl Marx actually even says the family, the family as we know it, should be gotten rid of. In fact, he said that mothers will be liberated from being stay-at-home moms. This was like, if you weren't a mom who was in a factory, you were a stay-at-home mom. You were at home raising your kids. Even those moms who would have to go to work, there would be some phase, some time that you would be home taking care of your children. And Karl Marx said, well, you know what? That's not really fulfilling work to be a stay-at-home mom. We want to liberate moms from the drudgery of having to raise their own children. So we're going to liberate moms from being stay-at-home moms, and mothers will now work in more meaningful work. We're going to allow moms to work in factories and in the fields. That's more meaningful. I mean, how boring it would be, how mind-numbing it would be to be a stay-at-home mom, Karl Marx argued, and we're going to let you moms do better work in the factories and in the fields. Who's going to take care of those 1-year-olds? Who's going to take care of those babies? Child care would be provided by the state. And so really for communism, the state is the answer to everything. Who's going to run the factories? The state is. Who's going to solve the problems of rich and poor? The state is. Who's going to take care of the children while the women are in the factories and the fields? Don't worry about that. The state is going to raise your children for you. That's what he believed. He also believed in the abolition of traditional sexual ethics. He promoted the community of women, or wife swapping. Wife swapping is this idea that, you know what, a woman shouldn't be limited to just one man. You know, a woman should be able to be free to have relationships with as many men as she wants. This was called wife swapping. He thought this old-fashioned idea that one man and one woman, this is old-fashioned. You don't need this anymore. So even sexual ethics are going to be changed. Karl Marx argued that we would have a dictatorship of the proletariat. That yes, we're going to have a dictatorship, but it's going to be the poor people pushing for this dictatorship. And this dictatorship of the proletariat would overthrow the rich. That is, again, the problem. The greatest problem is the rich people of the world. We would overthrow the rich. And now with the proletariat, now with the poor people rising up, there would be no more inequality. There would be no more inequality. That's the worst thing, is that when you look at the world around us, there's people who have and there are people who have not. After the communist revolution, there will be no more inequality, no more social classes. For communism, equality is essential. For communism, equality is essential. If there is inequality, that's the problem. And the goal in communist society is that all workers be paid the same. The goal is that all workers be paid the same. Well, there's a problem for this, you might have noticed, is that there is little incentive for hard work. There's very little incentive for hard work. Why would I work hard knowing I'm going to get paid the same regardless? There's this really good video we watched, a Vox video. I'll put the link again in comments, about them going to Cuba and taking a look at different Cuban restaurants. And there are the government-run Cuban restaurants. And those government-run Cuban restaurants are filled with a bunch of workers doing a lot of nothing. They're overstaffed. They don't really care about good service because, you know what? They get paid the same regardless. These government-run restaurants where everyone gets paid the same. And then there's a few private run restaurants where the food quality is better, the service is attentive. And the reason why it's like that is because they get paid based on how well they do. A problem with communism is that there's little incentive to work hard. What if I say everyone's going to get paid the same regardless, whether you come to work on time, whether you have a good work ethic, little incentive for hard work. In general, communism says that there is an economy that is planned by the government. And there's a name for this, where the government is in charge of all these details. What you make, how much you charge, the hours that you work, the color of shoes that you decide to make, the color of shirts that are sold in the store. A government where the economy is run by the government is called a command economy. There's the creation of an economy planned by the government. We call this a command economy. It is called a command economy because the government commands what will be made, what will be produced, how much will be charged. We call this a command economy. Now, for us in capitalism, our price, all the things that we desire and we want is based on supply and demand. I don't know if you've noticed lately, but in 2020, in April of 2020, you know what's happened to the price of gas? The price of gas has gone down. The reason why it's gone down is that with everyone staying home, there's been a less demand for gas. With less demand, they need to do something. No one's going to pay $2 plus for gas when there's not a demand for it. So they're reducing the price of gas to incentivize me and you to purchase gas. That's capitalism. It's supply and demand. People were price gouging on hand sanitizer. People were price gouging on bottled water or toilet paper because there wasn't a huge supply. So there was a greater demand, there was a little supply, so people raised the prices. That's how capitalism works. It's just based on the conditions of the market. Even like I keep getting advertisements for like 50% off plane travel, like air travel, 50% off hotels, because in spring of 2020, no one's flying. In spring of 2020, people aren't going to hotels, so they're slashing prices to get people to come. That's the kind of economy we have, but not in communism. In communism, the government decides this is how much a hotel room costs. The government decides how much of a gallon of milk costs. This is how much a stick of butter costs. It commands the costs of everything. And imagine how hard that is. One Russian professor in charge of setting prices during the communist period of the Soviet Union was a guy named Yuri Maltsev of Moscow State University. And he worked at the Soviet Institute of Labor and Research, where 400 workers, their job in the Soviet Union was to set the price for, write this down,